Hello?
Oh, yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hello?
Is this Mrs. Dorothy Letterman?
That's right, Dorothy.
Yes, it is. Who's this?
Are you the mother of David Letterman who does Late Night on NBC?
Hollywood has always had its power brokers, the gatekeepers who decide who rises and who disappears. But for nearly 3 decades, from 1962 to 1992, there was one man whose approval meant more than any studio executive, any producer, or any network suit sitting behind a mahogany desk. His name was Johnny Carson, and his show, The Tonight Show, wasn't just television. It was a verdict. A single appearance on that stage could transform a struggling comedian into a household name overnight. And a single misstep, a wrong joke, a business decision made without his blessing, or even just a prop brought on stage without permission, could end everything just as fast. What made Carson's power so unique and so quietly terrifying was how he wielded it. There were no press conferences, no public call-outs, no dramatic confrontations broadcast for the world to see. When Johnny Carson decided someone was done, he simply stopped acknowledging their existence. The invitations stopped arriving. The bookers stopped calling. And the rest of Hollywood, watching carefully from the sidelines, took the hint. If Johnny had turned his back on you, the industry turned its back too. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on the guests, the stars, and the personalities who found themselves permanently on the wrong side of Johnny Carson's smile, and the stories behind why they never came back. To understand why being banned from The Tonight Show carried such devastating consequences, you first have to understand what the show actually was during its golden era. This wasn't simply a program that aired after the 11 o'clock news. It was the cultural heartbeat of America. Millions of households made a nightly ritual. Parents settling into their armchairs, couples watching from bed, insomniacs finding companionship in Carson's calm, confident presence. There was no social media, no YouTube clip the next morning to catch up on what you missed. If you weren't watching live, the moment was gone. Carson had an almost supernatural ability to make viewers feel like they were sitting across the table from a trusted friend. He was effortlessly funny, without ever appearing to try. His comedic timing was so precise it felt instinctive rather than rehearsed. He could raise a single eyebrow in response to a guest's awkward comment and generate more laughter than most comedians could from a full 5-minute set. Night after night, he delivered, and America loved him for it. But The Tonight Show was more than entertainment, it was infrastructure. Booking agents understood that a strong Carson appearance could sell out a comedian's tour dates within hours. Movie studios knew that a charming sit-down with Johnny could push a film's opening weekend numbers in ways that advertising alone could not. Publishers watched their authors' book sales spike after a thoughtful conversation at Carson's desk. The show operated as the single most efficient marketing platform in the entertainment industry, and Carson controlled it completely. That control extended far beyond the production decisions made in Burbank. Carson's personal preferences shaped who got invited, how often they appeared, and whether they were treated as friends or merely tolerated as guests. Some performers were welcomed back again and again, becoming fixtures in the American living room. Others appeared once and were quietly never called again. And for a select few, those who crossed an invisible, unspoken line, the silence was absolute and permanent. Of all the stories tied to Johnny Carson's legendary cold shoulder, none is more layered or more heartbreaking than the one involving Joan Rivers. Their relationship began in the early 1960s when Rivers was still scratching for recognition in the comedy clubs of New York. She was sharp, fearless, and brutally funny, but the industry at the time had little patience for women who wanted to be comedians rather than simply decorative guests on variety shows. Carson changed that for her. When Rivers appeared on The Tonight Show for the first time and delivered set that stopped the room, Carson did something that altered the trajectory of her entire life. He turned directly to the camera, grinned that famous grin, and told the country that they were going to be hearing a lot more from this woman. In the entertainment world of the 1960s, that kind of endorsement from Johnny Carson was the equivalent of being knighted. Overnight, Rivers transformed from a struggling club performer into a legitimate national figure. The relationship deepened over the years. Carson brought Rivers back repeatedly, eventually trusting her enough to serve as his permanent guest host on the nights he was absent. For Rivers, this wasn't just a professional opportunity, it was deeply personal. Carson had believed in her when almost no one else did, and her loyalty to him was genuine and profound. She called him the most important figure in her career, not out of obligation but out of real gratitude, which is why 1986 became one of the most complicated and painful chapters of her life. Fox, a brand new television network hungry for credibility, approached Rivers with an extraordinary offer, her own late-night show. She would be the first woman in television history to host a major late-night program as its permanent host, not a fill-in, not a guest host, but the actual star of the show. It was the kind of opportunity that didn't come twice. Rivers was caught in an impossible position. She understood that NBC had no intention of handing her The Tonight Show when Carson eventually retired. She had quietly gathered enough information from people inside the network to know that despite her years of loyal service, she was not part of their long-term plan. Accepting the Fox deal wasn't a betrayal, it was survival. But in the chaos of negotiations and the pressure of making one of the biggest decisions of her career, she failed to tell Carson directly before the news became public. He found out through industry channels rather than from her. What followed was silence so complete it had its own weight. Carson refused to take her calls. He returned none of her letters. He did not acknowledge her publicly or privately. And beyond the personal wound, he made sure the professional consequences were clear. Anyone who appeared on Rivers' Fox program would find themselves unwelcome on The Tonight Show. For years, Rivers would describe the experience in interviews with a pain that never fully faded from her voice. She wrote to Carson annually, hoping for some response, some acknowledgement, some path toward reconciliation. None came. When Carson passed away in January 2005, Rivers mourned not only the loss of an industry giant, but the permanent closing of a door she had never stopped hoping might open. The reconciliation she had quietly longed for would never happen. She later reflected that she believed Carson felt a sense of ownership over her success, that because he had made her, she somehow belonged to him, and leaving felt to him like an act of betrayal so fundamental it could never be forgiven. Whether or not that interpretation is entirely fair, the result was the same. Two people who genuinely cared about each other never spoke again. What made Carson's world so difficult to navigate was that the rules were never written down or explained. There was no handbook distributed to guests explaining what Carson valued and what he found intolerable. You were simply expected to understand, and if you didn't, you found out through consequences rather than warnings. One rule that many performers learned the hard way was that Carson's stage was Carson's stage. He was the host, which meant he set the rhythm. He decided when a joke landed and when it went too far. He determined the pace of the conversation and the direction of the interview. Guests who instinctively understood this and worked within it thrived. Those who tried to redirect the spotlight toward themselves or who pushed a bit past the point where Carson was comfortable discovered quickly that the warmth behind his eyes could disappear without warning. Rich Little, the celebrated impressionist, learned that even affectionate material could carry consequences. Little was known for his ability to capture the voices and mannerisms of famous personalities with uncanny accuracy, and Carson was among his targets. For a while, this was acceptable. Carson could appreciate a well-executed impression of himself. But when Little returned to the well too frequently, using Carson as a recurring subject rather than an occasional one, the dynamic shifted. The official explanation was that Little's material had grown stale, but those close to the show understood that Carson had simply grown tired of being the punchline. The invitations dried up. Dana Carvey encountered a similar dynamic under circumstances that were almost accidental. Carvey, then riding high on the success of Wayne's World and his years on Saturday Night Live, had developed a Carson impression that was widely considered among the sharpest in the business. When he deployed it during a promotional appearance, the response from audiences was enthusiastic. But Carson, watching from behind the scenes, was not entertained. He had not asked to be imitated, and the impression, however technically impressive, felt like an intrusion. Carvey was not invited back. No explanation was offered because none was needed. Howie Mandel's experience illustrated yet another dimension of Carson's unwritten rules. Early in his career, Mandel brought a large prop on stage, a giant stuffed animal, that had not been cleared with the show's producers. His intention was simply to be memorable, to create a moment that would stick in people's minds. What he created instead was a disruption. Carson despised surprises on his set. Every element of the show existed within a carefully maintained order, and Mandel's unplanned prop shattered that order for a few uncomfortable minutes. Mandel was never invited back. No angry confrontation, no formal notice, just the quiet absence of future bookings. Not every exile from The Tonight Show came from a personal slight against Carson. Some performers were effectively excluded because what they had to say didn't fit the image Carson wanted to project or the image he felt America was ready to receive. Lola Falana was one of the most electrifying entertainers of her era. A dancer, singer, and actress of extraordinary talent, she lit up every stage she walked onto with an energy that was impossible to ignore. When she appeared on The Tonight Show, she was magnetic. But during one appearance, Falana spoke candidly about the racial barriers she faced in the entertainment industry, the invisible walls that limited opportunities for black performers regardless of their talent or their audience's enthusiasm for them. She spoke with honesty and specificity about what it meant to be a black woman trying to build a career in an industry that wasn't always willing to make room. It was exactly the kind of conversation that needed to happen, and exactly the kind of conversation that Carson's platform wasn't designed to host. The Tonight Show was built on the premise that it was a comfortable space, a nightly escape from the harder realities of American life. Carson's genius was in making viewers feel relaxed and entertained, and that formula didn't include sustained engagement with the structural inequalities that shaped the entertainment industry. Falana's honesty was inconvenient. The invitation stopped. It was never stated why, which made it all the more telling. Most of Carson's conflicts played out in the shadows, communicated through silence and absence rather than direct confrontation. But his feud with Wayne Newton was different. It became visible because Carson chose to make it visible. Newton was a Las Vegas institution, a performer who had built an empire through decades of shows that drew devoted audiences to the desert. He and Carson had maintained a cordial relationship for years, the kind of collegial goodwill that defined polished show business friendships. But in the early 1980s, Newton made a move that Carson interpreted as a personal challenge. He outbid Carson for partial ownership of the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas. From Newton's perspective, it was a straightforward real estate and business decision. From Carson's perspective, it was something else entirely. Rather than address the situation privately, Carson began working Newton into his monologues. Night after night, digs appeared. Comments about Newton's appearance, insinuations about his personal life, jokes that carried an edge clearly designed to diminish rather than to genuinely amuse. The audience laughed as audiences do, but people within the industry recognized what was happening. Carson was using the most powerful late-night platform in America to publicly mock someone who had gotten in his way. Newton eventually reached a breaking point and went to NBC studios to confront Carson directly. The exact details of their conversation have been described differently by various people over the years, but the outcome was consistent across all accounts. Carson stopped making jokes about Newton. The monologue material disappeared. But so did Newton's invitations to appear on the show. The peace that was reached was cold and transactional, and the friendship, such as it was, did not survive it.